It's like, hello everyone. This is Adam with Start Your Dungeons, and today we have a very special guest on. We have Matt Finch, the creator of Swords and Wizardry. So, how you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Just awesome. So, we have definitely been enjoying the new Mythmere Games products. Um, I've got my revised complete book and my tome of adventure design.
Uh-huh.
And I just wanted to start by saying I absolutely love the new formatting. I love the new layout. It's amazing.
Well, all the I can't take credit for any of that. That's all Susie Mosby, who is the other owner of Mythmere Games, and she handles everything that has to do with how a book looks and how it's laid out and all of that. So really, all that I do is the content words part
Mhm.
of it. So the entire new look, that everybody is getting a very very good reaction. I think across the board,
Mhm.
and that's all Susie. So
Well, you can tell her from us that we're also thumbs up.
very good.
Um, I had like a couple of questions, like as far as the tome of adventure design. I pitch that book to everybody as if you are a referee or game master, you need that book.
Uh,
You know, I was wondering, like, how long did it take to put that book together and to revise that for the new edition? Because it is so loaded with stuff.
uh, well, putting it together, what I mean, the how that started out was that um, when I was writing adventures, for the home game group or whatever, I would take notes because I work with a sort of a brainstorming, concept, and so I, be writing on a sheet of paper, and very often that would turn into a table because I would, think of, there's this, and it could be this. Oh, but it could be this or this or this or this, and eventually it starts getting resolved into two or three different columns of possibilities, and I kept those over the years, and sometimes would just add to them and then go back and refer to them uh, later. And so putting the book together was at least 10 years of but it wasn't steady work or anything like that. It
Right.
was just this slow accumulation of notes, and then every once in a while I'd find myself looking at two sheets of paper and saying, wow, okay, this is me doing the same thing at two different times in the
Right.
past. And so I would take a little while and combine the two into one page, first handwritten, and then later I started actually typing it out, so that I could print it out and have it, not have to interpret my own handwriting later on. Um, so the development of the book itself was a very very long period of time. It started accelerating once I actually decided to put it into a book, but the original idea for the book was going to be four smaller books, which and did the first couple of those and then realized, okay, this works better as a one volume thing. And so it evolved over the years really. And now revising it from the original version into the current version didn't take all that terribly long, because when you've written something that's very popular with fans, people don't like to see that changed very much. They'd usually rather see an addition to it, or something that's similar but different. But that people really don't like to see something that they view in their mind as a classic being changed. So we
Mhm.
decided we're not going to try and revise very much in terms of these tables. Really, the only thing that we did was, upgrade, modernizing some of the language, because a lot of it was written back um, in the early 2000s, when um, you used either he inclusively, or you used he or she,
Yeah.
and they was not really much in use at the time that this was written. So, little modernizations like that, just so that it wouldn't jar on the modern eye when you were reading it. And then the other thing that we did do that was the big step forward was those micro prompts in the margins that are all the
Hmm.
way down there. So um, we did those, and that took a while. I don't think I really kept track of how long that took. It wasn't all that terribly long really to do. It's just a lot of words. But
Yeah.
um, what I did was I just I would come up with a word combination, and then here's a slightly different one. I'll type that. Here's a slightly different one. I'll type that, and then randomized it all at the end,
Yeah.
so that all of those things that were very, very similar, you can't tell that there are a bunch of things in there that are really only slight changes from the other one. And so that wasn't all that terribly long, but overall, from the first concept of the book when I was taking notes to the final 512 page tome, it was a long journey to get from
Yeah.
one to the other.
Right.
I remember when that book hit my mailbox, I pulled it out. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't realize it was going to weigh as much as it was. I think
Yeah.
people have gotten used to seeing digest-sized books. They've gotten used to
Uh,
seeing, here's a book, and they're assuming that it's going to be, a 250 page book. 512 pages is a very heavy book.
yeah.
So,
Um, so one of the things that I wanted to ask about the new version of, or the revised version of Swords and Wizardry, was whose idea was it? Was it your idea to do the character reference sheet packs the way that you do them? Because doing the PDFs of everything that a character needs to just hit the ground running was just such a intuitive kind of thing. I just don't see that with a lot of other games.
uh-huh.
Where did that idea come from?
Actually, that idea came from Susie as well. She comes at it, often from the player perspective rather than from the game master's perspective. And I think that that's, every once in a while, most publishers are DMs. Um, and so I think, every once in a while, the entire industry can occasionally have a blind spot, where something is very, very desirable for players, and a lot of times you just don't really perceive that. And that was one of them. Was she said, look, let's just put everything together, in one PDF for convenience. And yeah, and those have been a very big success.
Yeah, you're gonna.
Yeah, I was about to say I think one of my big things, so I pretty much got into role-playing games because of Swords of Wizardry, and actually because of Adam literally playing the game for us, when I first started playing role-playing games. And I can see for somebody who wants to kind of get into a system that everything for one character in one go is pretty easy. And you see that a lot in like starter boxes in a lot of cases, like fifth
Yeah.
edition starter boxes will have your character sheet on the front, but you flip on the back and it says a level 2, you get these things. And I think it's a really great thing because I don't think Swords and Wizardry is necessarily a hard system to learn compared
Oh
to a lot
no.
of other systems on the market, but it is nice to kind of just hand somebody something and say, this is everything you need
Oh,
right here on
absolutely.
one sheet.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you say, I mean, it hasn't been a real big problem with Swords and Wizardry because it is a relatively simple system. But, even in the OSR systems, you often get the discussion, about, old school essentials versus Swords and Wizardry. And people point out, Swords and Wizardry has more of the examples of play
Right.
language in there
Mhm.
for people to read. And so people pick up on this. And I think anything that makes the game, easier for somebody who's just picking it up for the first time is good. Part of the downside, though, is that if you focus a lot on that, you also are you're creating words that are less useful to someone who has played it a lot. So there is a little bit of balancing there, but I think that by having the character reference packs, that solves that problem entirely, because it takes,
Right.
here's your player information, it removes it and puts it all in the one place for
Mhm.
somebody, and you can organize it, in a way that works better too.
Mhm.
So
Speaking of, you spoke about splitting your stuff up and talking about the Tome of Adventure Design kind of into smaller books. Looking at Old School Essential, who has done that and decided, hey, this is like what you need to be characters, what monsters and everything like that. Is that something you guys considered and then saw and then changed your mind? Did that come into any play looking at theirs? Because I think it's a very interesting way how they have it set up in their books to say, here's a box set with 5 little volumes almost ready to go, and you only need to read these little bits depending on what you're doing for the game.
mhm. um, I think that we, for one thing, we didn't do very much looking at Old School Essentials in
Okay.
terms of designing the book, because Swords and Wizardry has been out since 2008,
Mhm.
and so there was a lot of it that was already, I mean, obviously organization isn't hardwired. You could take every piece out and reorganize it in a
Mhm.
particular way, but I like the way that it does flow. I think OSE. Again, I'm repeating what people have said. OSE tends to be better as a reference tool, but not as strong as a teaching tool. And I think that in
Mhm.
some ways those are actually mutually exclusive.
Mhm.
That if you're spending your time on the teaching tool and the reading it through, then you are, by definition, organizing your things in such a way that you can't do the 2-page spread, that
Right.
OSE sort of does. So I think mainly the answer to the question, though, is that really we just kind of followed what we thought organically was the right flow for the game.
Okay.
So
Very cool.
I always wondered, so like I used to own one of the reprints of the original, white box, like the one that Wizards of the Coast put out in
yeah.
like 2012 or something like that. And I read all of those books. And in the end, I just decided, why in the world am I struggling so hard with this when I have Swords and Wizardry sitting right here? How in the world does anybody play the original game without having something like Swords and Wizardry just sitting there?
Well, I think if it was certainly if it was the first one you played, um, it became hardwired into your head. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's favorite edition is the first one that they played. Pretty much, they always see that as being the gold
Yeah.
standard, and and you see that edition after edition that all of a sudden there's a new set of people who have a one that they think is the best, but the uh, it does make its own. So if you read it having played war games, it makes much more sense. It's organized in a way that does make
Yeah.
sense, and you got to keep in mind that when they first came to this, it was from the wargaming background, and they had the new ideas that Dave Arneson had in there, and obviously, if you're playing any sort of skirmish war game, somebody is going to start doing a voice for their guy,
Yeah.
and you start having role playing beginning almost out of nowhere, and I'm sure that happening in chainmail was part of what made Gary understand, what was going to happen when the game ended up being played. But they had to, invent the entire way of explaining the rules of an RPG, which none of the rest of us have to, because it's been done and then it's been
Yeah.
redone and it's been redone. So for us, there's a lot of things that are, simply a better way of presenting something, but they were doing it for the very absolute first time, and they used the wargaming model, I think, and in some ways that worked really well, and in other areas it makes it really, really hard to remember where to look something up because it's not organized in a way that's familiar. But I think they have to get a ton of credit, for the fact that they were doing it absolutely for the first time. And I think,
Yeah.
for the first shot at it, they did a really good job with those
Yeah.
books.
Yeah.
Especially given the fact that, it was really successful. So they had, here's a supplement and here's a supplement and here's a supplement. They're trying to integrate all of that stuff in there.
Yeah.
I think they did okay. But, there's no question that it has become easier in hindsight to organize a set of role-playing rules than it could possibly have been when they first started.
Yeah. I mean, especially, not only because of the fact that we have precedent from, all these previous games, but also the technology we have, just the
Right.
fact that we can just throw everything together, in a word processor and something like, Adobe InDesign or something and just be done.
Yeah, if I have a great idea on page 100 that really belongs on page 3, I can go back and put it in page 3 without having to retype 97 pages.
100%.
Oh gosh. I can't even imagine. Um, let me see. I will, so without like trying to dig into what's coming next too much. I don't know if you have any, another Kickstarter lined up, but do you see there being an official setting book for this version of Swords and Wizardry?
Well, I hate the concept of an official setting, but we are going to do one because a lot of people, want one. It's just I don't see it as all being official. But yeah, we're doing a Kickstarter that will probably launch in late May or early April,
Okay.
and that will contain a monster book. It will contain a book of options, supplemental additional rules that you can put in if you like them. Most of what we've got in there is character classes. There are also encounter tables for incorporating the monsters from the monster book in there, which is a fairly large page count in there. There are new spells for the new character classes. I think there's about 10 new character classes that people can use.
Nice.
And that Kickstarter will also come out with most likely um, a copy of the only reason I'm hesitating here is because when you're designing a Kickstarter, you try and keep it in as few tiers as possible, and so we haven't decided exactly how this is all broken out. But we're going to have a relayed out version of Tomb of the Iron God, which is one of the very popular modules from way back.
I have that one.
Okay, awesome. So,
Yeah.
and I'm really, really excited about the map. I did all my own layouts and maps and artwork in the earlier versions of that, and
Yeah.
it's a good reason why I need help with things like that. There's going to be that, and we're going to start introducing a setting, and it's going to be we're not going to do a great big old setting book to start out with. What we're going to do is a small area around a central city, very much like the free city of Greyhawk in Greyhawk. This is the free city of Herengard. It is quite different from the Greyhawk setting in that it's probably earlier in the time. Feel wise, it's a little earlier in the medieval period than Gary, who tended to think in terms of the 1400s. Here we're probably looking at around 600, 700. And the Cataclysm, of course, is completely different than the fall of the Roman Empire. The Cataclysm here is it results from a planar conjunction, but it has various different results in the world that push everything back to a dark age, which you almost have to have in a fantasy setting, a prior empire to dig all of those giant dungeons and leave all of that gold lying around, and all of those ruins, and so on. So that's an almost built-in part of the setting. It's going to be a small area. It's going to be a hex crawl. Very much in the model that Judges Guild used to do. They came out with connected maps with scattered detail on hexes, which I think is a model that really hasn't been surpassed for the small scale hex crawl sort of adventuring. Just in terms of what you provide to the referee to use is that model. I think it works the best. Other types of campaigns I think work better differently. I mean, if you're doing a freewheeling, traveling sort of campaign, then the Greyhawk type, travelogue works better. But we're going to go with the assumption that at Foundation, nobody doesn't want a hex crawl. Some people want more than a hex crawl, but nobody doesn't want the ability to do something like that if they feel like it. So
Yeah.
That's kind of the way that we're doing that. So the answer is that this coming Kickstarter, Lord, I've been talking forever. I don't know, but my voice is starting to go. But
Sorry.
this coming Kickstarter is going to have the monster book, the supplemental rule book, and then smaller books will be Tomb of the Iron God, which is located in this little setting area, which is the domain of Herengard. So that's where we're going to, and that'll be in late March or early April.
That sounds really good, because I was thinking about the Legacy of Blackscale Lagoon that James Spahn wrote for this version, and it's got your hex crawl sitting there, and it would be really nice to have Tomb of the Iron God, and just have, I got a hex crawl over here and a hex crawl over here. Hey, just smash them together.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's funny. The OSR, moves in fashions. The hex crawls are very big right now. They've been big, in the past, but people tend to focus as a group on, one thing. When the OSR really pretty much started out, it was all about, advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then the original Dungeons and Dragons players, who were fewer, suddenly sort of became cooler. And so, a lot of people, started looking into original Dungeons and Dragons as a thing. And then after that, a BX, D&D, those guys came in. Everything moves in phases. I think right at the moment, people are particularly looking for hex crawl sort of adventures, or at least the ability to connect their adventures via a hex crawl. So we're going to be doing that in terms of the way that we do the campaign world.
That was great. Do you have any?
I was going to ask a question. We talk a lot about like the OSR, and I think definitely it's a big movement that's sort of happening right now. And it's interesting to see, because I think we see things that are similar, with, like, to name a few that have, to me, a similar vibe in terms of like the system they've grown from, is something like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which, though a little bit darker, more horror aspect, is still kind of in that old vibe. And then you have like Swords and Wizardry, but then you have almost a new kid on the block that's similar but very different in like the Morkborg kind of stuff, where it's still brutal, because I think a lot of people don't realize that there's brutalness in something like Swords and Wizardry. Like, I literally was telling someone the other day who's going to try it for the first time, you can run, it's okay. You don't have to just die.
Right.
But I think those are two different movements that have kind of started, where people are either going back to something that feels similar, or Mortborg, which to me in some ways feels like it took what was there before and then kind of shifted it into a darker tone, or maybe a tougher tone. Do you think that eventually something like, and this may be a big question, but something like Mortborg and those things might at some point push OSR stuff a little bit to the side and overtake it?
Well, okay, so there's different schools of thought about what OSR even means. Right. And so I'm in the group of people who thinks that the OSR is a very, very broad category. I think the thing that unites all of the OSR games is that there's a large element of improvisational interpretation of how to play the game. Rules don't necessarily cover, everything, and so there's a highly improvisational element. That alone probably doesn't define the OSR, but I think that's in common with all of the OSR games. And then people tag on, I like playing a highly lethal game, or I like playing a beer and pretzels game, or I like old black and white art, or whatever it is that actually comes from the real history is tagged onto that. So with that said, I view the simple games like Mork Borg to still be entirely part of what I think of as the OSR, because they have in common with the old original games, that they don't try and write a rule for everything. They expect
Right.
that the players and the DM are going to be deciding on the fly how they're going to handle a particular situation. So the way that I think of the OSR, no, Mork Borg won't push the OSR aside because it's part of it.
Okay.
More things will get added in. More of these games will develop. Someone will come up with a Mork Borg-ish Swords and Wizardry. Somebody will come up with a Swords and Wizardry-ish Mork Borg. It all develops like that rather than being really a matter of pushing something out. The only thing I think you might see, pushing out is when you've got something like, it has to be different enough to be like, a story game where, something is affecting the narrative rather than it being a war game where people are talking for their pawns. This is what my pawn says. If it gets beyond that, then that I think begins to get outside of the OSR, and you might see something shift one way or the other. But Mork Borg, I would say, is definitely a part of the OSR because it's a simple, improvisational game. This fantasy, and so it
Right.
all fits.
I think it's very interesting to see what Morkborg has kind of done, I think, in some ways, because it's kind of something I am not a huge fan of just basic Morkborg personally, but I think it's incredible to see how explosive it's been in terms of creative design for all these different people. We had Luke on for Pirate Borg, and his book blew me away because it just felt so much different, even though it's kind of the same system in some ways. It felt so different, and I'm always intrigued to see because I think some people really look at or who are part of the OSR don't really like what Morkborg is. They feel like it's kind of a too different. So I was
Uh,
intrigued to see kind of what your opinion was on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely have a much broader view of what the OSR is than a lot of the other people, who are in the OSR.
Right.
Um, but everybody's got their own definition of it. Mine just happens to be a fairly broad one.
Fair enough.
I thought of something to ask. So with Swords and Wizardry having so many people who have played it over the years, and there are so many clones of Swords and Wizardry out there.
Yes.
Have you played any of those?
Oh, I I think I've played Ruins and Ronin, but that's one of the ones from back in like 2008. Right after we
Yeah.
came out with Swords and Wizardry, there was a whole host of small games based on it, and at that point, it wasn't people trying to reach um, a better OD&D clone by taking Swords and Wizardry and altering it there. What people were mostly doing at that point in time was doing, there was a game called Woodland Warriors, which was, little furry animals,
Hmm.
using swords and wizardry rules. There was Hulks and Horrors, which
Yeah.
was basically, Warhammer 40K, but
Yep.
using swords and wizardry rules. And so there was
Space
there was a
Hulk.
lot of that. Yeah, exactly. But I really haven't so much. I've read a lot of them, of course, because
Mhm.
a lot of people send me a copy. Or somebody says, this and such is way more authentic than Swords and Wizardry, and I go take a look, and usually it's, usually I wouldn't say way more authentic. I
Yeah.
would usually say, more authentic, but they're really risking a copyright,
Yeah.
Yeah.
at some point. So you can only get so authentic, people. That's,
Yeah.
Yeah.
there's a point where you cross the legal barrier.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Um, I I was wondering, since we've gotten a revised version of Swords and Wizardry complete, is there any chance that we will at some point revisit White Box or Core for revised copies, even if they're PDFs?
White box, definitely yes. So James Spawn has written a what's called a white box cyclopedia, which is an expanded version of white box,
Mhm.
and he's going to be doing a Kickstarter for that in a few months. And so, and there's one thing that he's not doing in there, which is that I think he's using only ascending armor class in there.
Okay.
And so I talked to him and I said, okay, let's do this. We'll publish uh, an updated white box. Um, and so we have actually done that. All the work is done. I've added the encounter tables, some more information from the Underworld and Wilderness book. A lot of the things that people often say is, made white box incomplete. I've added, a lot of that stuff in. And we're going to come out with that, probably as a print on demand thing. Trying to be in support of James's book as being okay, here's the original tentpole white box. But if you want to play an expanded version of white box, Mythmere Games is not going to do that. That's, James has got an expanded version because the thing is that I don't actually play white box. Never have. Never have. As a referee, I really like you using many dice, having a wider spread of numbers. I am not. I get what people are doing with white box, but it's just not my type of game. I prefer the more wider scope thing. So the answer to the question of are we going to do something with white box thing is yeah, and in fact we're almost done. It's already laid out.
Mhm.
And in fact, I read through and checked the layout today. So that's coming very, very soon.
Nice.
Now, core, don't have any plans for core right at the moment. We may do something that is a free basic version of Swords and Wizardry that would approximate core. But core was always a very difficult sell in terms of explaining it to people because it wasn't this book. We did this book, but not this book. What it was we did all the stuff I liked from this book and some of this book.
Yeah.
It was my version of OD&D that I played back in 2008. Not my version. It wasn't a fantasy heartbreaker. It was just the rules that I'd picked and chosen. So I didn't it didn't have the stuff in it that wasn't something that I used. So that was a very personalized addition to me. So at the moment, we don't have any plans for doing that. That's not to say we won't, because there's a lot of people who came down almost exactly where I did in terms of what they liked. It's a large population, but right at the moment, we don't have any plans for core. But white box, yes, that's something that's coming very soon.
So I was thinking about core because I came to Swords and Wizardry because I had taken a long hiatus from gaming. So I had, played in college and then took a long time away, came back to it after I had finished grad school, and the game that I grabbed was Swords and Wizardry Core.
Okay.
And, I saw that, it was on Lulu. I grabbed the PDF, just like, oh, okay, what's this all about? It looks like fantasy role playing, like I like. And
Mhm.
it became the game that I loved.
Yeah.
And, just like my copy that I got printed from Lulu was, that's just kind of always been on my shelf, ready to go.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
it's like I said, there are a lot of people who like that particular mix,
mhm.
of content for the game. But it's hard. It's very hard to explain to somebody who's just gotten on the internet and says, hey, what should I, which version of Swords and Wizardry should I play? Well, you can play White Box, which is the first three books, or you can play Complete, which is everything that they ever did plus
Right.
stuff from magazine. Or you can play this middle zone here, which is the stuff that Matt really liked in 2008. It's just it doesn't it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about when you talked about print on demand versus Kickstarter. I feel like less people doing print on demand nowadays. I think Kickstarter or like um, GameFound or something like that has kind of grown. Do you feel like is easier in some ways to do a Kickstarter, or is it easier to almost do print on demand for products, especially if you look at, say, like smaller books instead of like big, like the Adventure Tome? That's something you may want to get the Kickstarter for, but for smaller things, is print on demand something that you guys see as like a valuable option to give people?
Oh yeah, but I wouldn't say that it's a matter of easier or harder. So Phil Reed, who was the president of Steve Jackson Games and is a wonderful guy and does a lot of very, very creative old school stuff. He has done a lot of experiments with this stuff. And so his thing, what he says, and I agree with it, is that if you're a publisher and you want to do a print product, offset print, you will have more people come to your Kickstarter, more people will buy the Kickstarter, and you will make more profit. However, if you do a print on demand one, people will you will not make as much money, but it will be much easier to do the Kickstarter, to explain the Kickstarter, to do all of the back end stuff on the Kickstarter. Now there is some downside on print on demand, at least right at the moment. It's like a month-long turnaround from drive-through to see a proof. I mean, we've
Oh,
had
wow.
our old City Encounters book, has been out for a couple of weeks, and we're not even looking, at the calendar yet for when that comes in. So,
Mm.
and if you have a problem with that proof where you put in, the wrong file type on a graphic or something like that, it's another month before you see the next proof. So it can be a
Wow.
very, very slow grinding process to get
Mhm.
something ready to sell on print on demand. And then, like I said, also, uh, the costing structure is very different. I mean, ultimately, uh, if you've got a large enough Kickstarter audience to know that you're going to hit a particular minimum number of orders, then you are going to be able to price it so that your customers are paying less
Right.
than you would be if you were doing POD, because the
Okay.
printer charges you a whole lot less to do an offset per unit. As long as there's enough of them, the printer's charging you way less than drive-through does, and so you can pass on some of that savings to the customer and still have a better pricing than the people who are trying to compete with you just by doing print on demand. In general, in terms of customer value, um, because also printing quality is usually less and
Mhm.
on a print on demand presses. So, you generally, the customer is going to end up being better off if you're doing a Kickstarter for an offset print run. Um, However, there are a lot of conveniences to POD. Like there are a bunch of people who go to drive through. That's the only place they ever buy anything, and if it's not on drive through, they won't get it. So you want to have POD copies for that
Right.
audience. So an enormous number of variables that come into it. I mean, what we do in general is we do both. We
Mhm.
do an offset print run, and then for the people who either didn't get one of those copies, we haven't sold out yet of any of the stuff that we've got, but we will eventually. So we will also make something available on print on demand.
Okay.
Which I found, really interesting that that your drive-through version of Swords and Wizardry Revised has the Errol Otis cover, which, you know, I don't know what it is about the Errol Otis covers. Every time I see one of the covers, my first reaction is I don't like it. And then a
Uh-huh.
week later, I come back to it and I just can't stop staring at it.
And I think that's with anything by Errol, any of Errol's book covers. The ones he did back for TSR. A lot of times, my first reaction to something was, "Oh, I'm not sure I like that." Then you go back and you look at it again, and then you can't forget it. The
Yeah.
Githyanki, who's it's just um, yeah. Errol is a very it's very interesting what his art does to your head,
Yeah.
because it gets in there and then it doesn't let go.
It's always very colorful
Mhm.
and just pops. And I feel like that's very different from the Peter Mullen art that was on the original White Box and Core, because those you immediately look at them and say, "Oh, I know exactly what's in the book." And
Mhm.
I love those I love that art, but it evokes a very different mental space whenever you're looking at Errol Otis versus Peter Mullen.
Mhm. Or even more so, I think, Errol versus somebody who is more representational, like Larry Elmore, for example,
Yeah.
where, there's, you're seeing, just what you would expect to see, in terms
Mhm.
of the human figures and so on, without any weird shapes or anything like that in there. And Errol, he's definitely a standout in the field.
Mhm. Well, that's all I had prepared. Do you have
I have
any?
I have one question I want to ask. So, because we're a channel that cares about starter sets, do you think Swords and Wizardry could benefit from having like a starter set on a shelf, like where you see right along product lines, go into game store and see like D&D, Cyberpunk Red, and then it's like a Swords and Wizardry one. Is that something that you think this is something down the line we would eventually consider doing and want to have in stores for people to get into the Swords and Wizardry system?
Well, okay, so that means it's in order to get something into the stores, it means it's got to be going through the distribution system.
Right.
And so far, we've avoided doing that. When we're doing the model that we're using right now of the Kickstarters, our newsletter, we've got a fairly accurate ability to predict how many books we're going to be printing, and therefore we don't have to hedge our bets by charging customers more money in order to protect ourselves against a risk.
Mm.
Mhm.
When you are going through distribution, you um, you have a larger unknown quantity because some of
Right.
those books can come back to you at some point in the future.
Mhm.
You've got you're simply working with larger numbers on that, and so it might be. I think we Swords and Wizardry would have to, I think, roughly double in size fan base
Okay.
wise before that would become the kind of thing where we felt like we could still deliver the best value to the customers and still absorb the potential risks that come with working through
Mm.
Mhm.
distribution. And that's a really long discussion that I won't even go into what the factors are there, but we could certainly become large enough that
Right.
going through distribution would be something that was advisable. We could probably do it now if we went to one of the small distributors and said, "Hey, these are what our sales look like." We're probably a candidate to go into
Mhm.
uh, distribution, but it's also a lot of work because when you've got a distributor, they expect you to be able to tell you about your products long enough in advance for them to get them into a catalog. They've got to get all of
Right.
the pictures, they've got to get the sales text, and so you end up spending a lot more time on the business of the business rather than on writing cool stuff for
Yeah.
games.
Mm.
So those are the various factors involved, with that. So yeah, I mean, it would be a possibility. We'll see. I mean, if we get one, this next Kickstarter that we do probably won't be as large as the underlying game system, just because anytime you do supplements, it's not as large, as
Mhm.
the thing. But if something weird happens, and we have a Shadow Dark moment where we bring in, more than $1 million on a Kickstarter, then yeah, then
Yeah.
then we would probably be in a position where the next step would be to try and get it into game stores. But any game store can call, can email us, and we'll sell it to them on the same terms that they would be getting from a distributor. So
Right.
we're not boxed out of the market. It's just we don't have somebody pushing us into the game stores.
Right. Do you think that it is hard to do that more so now with more of the similar systems? Like, do you think that's something that maybe that opportunity is a lot harder now than it would have been if you had tried to do so a few years ago? Or do you think that it actually, because of how many options there are, you might have a better chance of selling because someone goes, "Oh, I really like this, and I've heard, Old School Essentials, and I've heard Swords of Wizardry has like a similar feel. Pick it up off." Or what is your opinion on that?
I think it's just the second of your two options. I think it's
Mhm.
easier now than it would have been, 5 years ago, simply because, we've had the huge popularity of fifth edition, which is behind behind a lot of this. And then there are enough, larger old school systems that people understand that there may be a difference between old school essentials and any of the others, and that it's a valid, legitimate difference, and that these things are that it's worth picking up more than one of them. So I would say it's the second of the two options.
And also, now that people are running away from some systems and looking for alternatives.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be helpful in the short run.
Yeah.
But in the long run, having a big mainstream popular fantasy role playing game benefits all of the smaller,
Right.
weirder versions much more than people being pissed at the big company and going and buy. And this week I'm going to buy a copy of all 4 of the OSR systems that I can think of. That'll show them, but in the long term, it doesn't actually help. So.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely interesting. I run a lot of games at our local game store, and I pretty much tell people I run all the indie or non D&D sort of stuff. But it is very interesting to see a lot of these players who are just like always, oh, I come from D&D. I saw D&D. I wanted to play D&D, but they didn't have a spot open in Adventure League, so I thought I'd try your Dragonbane game or whatever. And I think it's very interesting to see, like you said, for a short term, there will be that shift where people are like, bah, phooey on you for doing this to like other people trying to use your system. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Right.
But I think it does help, like you said, because without these people trying D&D, they may have not have had the opportunity to find that there's other options available for them.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree.
Very good. Well, I think, do you have any other questions, Adam, before I get to the silly fun ones?
Oh no, I've geeked out enough.
Fair enough. Well, we always ask 5 fun questions, Matt. They're a little bit different, but I really like them. I think I surprised some people with them so far. But my first one I always like to ask is, besides Swords and Wizardry, what would you say is your favorite RPG system?
Well, there's 2, and it's probably tied for different reasons, but I would Call of Cthulhu and Traveller.
Okay, very good.
Didn't expect Traveller.
Yeah, Traveller, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's been around for for a long time and tried and true, but I never think of it. I guess I never think to pick it up. But Call of Cthulhu.
I think Traveller is in the hindbrain of most science fiction out there. I mean, look at Firefly. Look at all of the stuff. A lot of stuff shows that Traveller DNA in there.
Yeah, very cool.
What is your favorite type of candy?
Hershey bars with whole almonds.
Nice.
I respect. If you could work with somebody you haven't worked yet in the gaming industry, who would it be and why?
Harley Stroh. And it's just because he is a really wonderful adventure designer, and I would love to get into his head and see, how that process works with him, and whether I can learn some stuff from him. So Harley Stroh, Stroh is his last name.
Okay. Very cool. If you could ride any animal into battle, what would it be and why?
Is the animal going to do what I tell it to do?
Yes.
Rhinoceros.
Okay. I like this. It was a good answer. Not. I like the whole "is it going to listen to me" thing. Like,
let me ask one very important question first.
I like it. And then our final one is, what is your opinion on garden gnomes overall?
Garden gnomes overall.
Yeah.
Garden. I mean, I kind of like garden gnomes.
See,
I'm of the generation that actually had that gnomes book, the big coffee table book of gnomes out in bookstores, and so I think you've got to kind of love garden gnomes if you were exposed to that as a kid.
No,
That's a beautiful book.
It's great. It's wonderful.
See, I remember seeing that as a kid, and I didn't own a copy. I just remember seeing it, I guess, in a bookstore, and my mom saying, "Hey, that's too expensive, put it down."
Yeah.
And so now I've got a couple of garden gnomes out front.
There you go. Now, I do not have garden gnomes at my house, so maybe I'm a little bit hypocritical saying I love garden gnomes when I don't have any. But there
But
you go.
I love their little pointy hats.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that is all the
Now,
fun.
gnomes in D&D, I'm not fond of, but that's a question for another
Oh,
day.
I kind of want to speak a little on this now. Now I got to know.
Oh, I've assumed since they've never been in Swords and Wizardry that they will never be in Swords and
Well,
Wizardry.
okay, so that is yet a third point. Part of the thing with that is that Gary wrote in OD&D that gnomes are just like dwarves, only smaller. And later versions of gnomes, the version of gnomes that people like, are much less like dwarves and more like sort of fey characters. They've got illusionist capabilities. But since Swords and Wizardry is a clone of OD&D, and Gary actually did say that in there, that would be something where I'd be, definitely changing something, even though it was really just a couple of tossed off sentences. And then I would have to say, okay, Gary said this, I'm changing it to this because that's just sort of the methodology I use when I am departing, from the actual OD&D stuff is I alert the reader to it. And it's just, too much trouble. So that's the reason that Swords and Wizardry doesn't have gnomes, because Gary did actually say something about gnomes. It was only a couple of sentences. It was completely changed in all of the other editions. And so that it just sort of leaves gnomes in a very uncomfortable gap for the purposes of an original Dungeons and Dragons retro clone. They're kind of screwed.
Yeah.
Fair enough. That is fun. Well, Matt, I just want to thank you, for taking the time to sit down, talk with us. It's been an absolute pleasure to do so. If people want to find out more about what you're doing or anything about, what Mythmire Games is doing, where can they find all that information?
Well, the first place is mythmeregames.com. That's our website, and people can go there. And you can sign up for our newsletter when you're there at the site. So that's probably the easiest way to do it. We do have a Discord channel, which is Mythmere Games. And we also have a Facebook page and a Facebook group called the Official Swords and Wizardry Group. We use those a little bit less often. Those are more for, when we've got an announcement or so on and so forth. But you can find us there. But the first and easiest way to find us is just to go to mythmeregames.com. So
we'll link that down in the description of the video to get people there as quickly as possible.
Awesome.
So thank you so much. And it was really great to talk with you.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.